Hello, this is Laura Fulford welcoming you to this Bite-Sized Bio web seminar. Today's discussion is titled What to Expect from Your PhD Supervisor and What They Should Expect from You. And today our panellists are Professor Phil Blower, Dr. Dana Infante and Dr. Jonathan Yewdell. Professor Philip Blower is a Professor of Imaging Chemistry and a Department Head of the Imaging Chemistry and Biology Department at King's College London. Dr. Dana Infante is Assistant Professor in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife at Michigan State University, and Dr. John Yewdell works at the NIH National Institute for Allergies and Infectious Diseases. And all these three PIs have experience with supervising PhD students. And today we're just going to really kind of get to the nitty-gritty of what really a PhD supervisor's role is and how that can differ between supervisors and between students as well. As this is a panel discussion, we're welcoming questions from the audience, which I will pitch at any point. So if you do have any questions at any point, just drop them into the questions box, which appear at the right side of your screen, and I'll put them to the panel. So let's kick things off with the first question. Firstly, what do you feel the role of a PhD supervisor is initially for new start PhD students in terms of support? And this means academically, technically, and emotionally. And let's start with Phil for this one.
Just to give everybody the idea, you've suggested a few things to address, so I'll start with those. So you've suggested, should a PhD supervisor be responsible for showing a PhD student how to perform experiments? And I think ideally a supervisor should be part of an organisation, an infrastructure which enables them to delegate that to people who really know the ins and outs of doing those kinds of experiments. So I think a supervisor, and certainly a head of department, should be responsible for creating an infrastructure that can do that, but not necessarily personally showing students hands-on how to do things. I mean, I used to have a supervisor when I was a postdoc who would proudly tell people that he thinks it's important to be able to perform or know the ins and outs of every technique that he expected his students to do. And in certain areas where there's a lot of multidisciplinary research, that just is not feasible. So it's about creating the infrastructure to make that happen. And it's easy if you've got a big group already and you have people who can show them. If you are starting out as a supervisor, this may be your first PhD student, then of course you will be much more hands-on in terms of showing a student how to get started doing experiments. But again, there's a role in getting other people involved and showing the student that it really is up to them to take ownership and go and find other people as well who can show them these skills.
That brings up the point of that actually it's almost better for the PhD supervisor to not be the one doing that because they might not know all the techniques.
But also it's getting the student to have the right attitude from the start. It's their project. They need to take the initiative. And this is a question that you'll be talking about later on, I know. So getting a student completely immersed in the idea that it's them that is driving the project. It's their project. The supervisor will be there to help whatever situation comes up as a result of that. But it's not really a matter of the supervisor telling the student how to do everything. It's about getting the student to understand that it's up to them to go and find out. And the supervisor can then point them to the right places and the right people to find out from.
What about, do you feel like, in terms of the emotional side of a PhD, do you think a supervisor has any responsibility in terms of the emotional roller coaster that a PhD can be and making sure that the student is okay emotionally?
I wouldn't call it a responsibility. I think the supervisor should know where to send students to get emotional support or for counselling, the university resources that will be available these days. Although a supervisor will undoubtedly be a much, much better supervisor if they are able to identify when those kinds of support need to be given and able to give it. It's not the supervisor's job to make sure the student gets a PhD, but it certainly reflects badly on a supervisor when a student doesn't get a PhD. Yeah. And so there's a lot of incentive to be as supportive as possible.
Dana, how do you feel about what Phil's been saying there in terms of both the responsibility in terms of the techniques, but also in terms of the emotional support that a supervisor should provide to a student?
First, regarding the responsibility of the student to be self-motivated, have initiative, be a self-learner, I feel philosophically that is what becoming a PhD is about. You become someone who can teach yourself, train yourself, and ultimately teach others. So in my role as a PhD advisor and advisor of postdocs, I feel it's a bit of a guiding role where I'm not telling them how to do everything necessarily, but perhaps pointing them in the direction of a good resource to use, a good book to read, a paper to check out that can sort of help them along that way.
Do you feel that it's also that students should be actually going out themselves and finding these resources, maybe going and speaking to another lab head or another postdoc that has experience in this, or do you feel that actually the supervisor maybe should be mediating that and going out and introducing them? How much independence do you feel there should be in that situation?
And to some degree, I feel like the level of responsibility changes over a PhD student's career. Towards the beginning, I play a much more hands-on role with the students, telling them who to reach out to, what to read, what to look at. But by the end, especially as they're wrapping up their dissertation, I feel it's a lot more their own responsibility to have done the research, know where to go. At that point, they likely know things that I have not heard of before, and I'm learning from them at that stage.
John, not to leave you out, the one thing that we haven't really covered a lot there is the emotional side of things. How important do you think it is for a PhD supervisor to be in tuned emotionally to a new PhD student and help them through what can be quite a daunting time?
Good question. And there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all answer for this. Your PhD supervisor is not your mother or your father or your spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend. They should be aware of what's going on emotionally with you, but they are not responsible for you. And I think what Phil and Donna said is just, it's perfect. I mean, there's no point of your career as a PhD student where a fairy is going to fly over your head and sprinkle you with dust, and all of a sudden you're going to be an independent investigator. As soon as possible, you should be self-motivated. Motivation, that's got to come from yourself, and you should be owning your project as quickly as possible. For some kids, that could be even a few weeks. For others, it may take 4 or 5 years for the light to go on. All during that time, it's not the PI's responsibility for your emotional well-being. And I think Phil answered the question perfectly. It's good to be in tune where the people in your lab are and to point them to professionals if there really is something serious emotionally. But I think it's very useful to have a friendly but professional relationship. Okay, and so you've got that on the slide as well. Friend, yes, but not in the same sense of a friend who's going to be a contemporary. And when you first start out, you tend to be much more of a friend to your people, and that has advantages, but it also has significant disadvantages. And I think as you mature in the role as a PI, you take a more distance role, you're better aware of what's going on with the people, and you're sort of better able to serve them with the emotional distance that you now have.
Phil's got a comment?
Completely agree with all of that. The word motivation has come up quite a bit. I just don't think there's any motivating to be done. If a student is not motivated from the beginning, they just should not be doing a PhD. There has to be good reasons for doing a PhD. In my opinion, one of those reasons is to enjoy it and just get something from it in terms of having fun, really, as well as a career step. And if a student doesn't have that motivation from the beginning, it's going to be a lost cause.
Okay, I think this takes us nicely into the next question, which actually, from your experiences, your own experiences with working with PhD students, and I guess in some ways this could be extrapolated to postdocs as well, are there specific things that you feel that students think is the role of a supervisor, but is actually not and is out with the scope? So you've already said motivation, and I think we can say there's a consensus there that it is not the role of a supervisor to motivate the student has to have them themselves, otherwise there's pretty much no point in them doing a PhD. But there are other things that you found during your time that students maybe think that you should be doing but actually is out with your scope. Let's start with Dana on that one.
I think that in selecting PhD students and postdocs, I've been fortunate to have had the opportunity to get to know almost every one of them a little bit ahead of time. They came in with some fairly realistic expectations. One challenge that was shared by a couple of individuals might be fair to say was the degree to which they thought that I would be participating in conducting analyses and writing up the results versus providing a more editorial role on the manuscripts and sort of guiding how the experiments occurred. And this maybe was a reflection of their lack of understanding of how divided my time was, their potential hopes for how we would interact, but it was pretty easy to work with people after a time on this.
Okay, and you think that getting to know them a little bit beforehand, before they start, was really useful?
For me, it was very important, and it was important not only that I got to know them, but to the best degree that I could before agreeing to work with a student, that they understood who I am, how I work, got some impressions from previous folks that I had worked with, so they knew sort of my unique working style.
John, have you ever had any experiences with people thinking that you should do more than your role, and what were those things, if you had any, that people felt you should be doing?
I mostly have had postdocs, and so that hasn't been that big of an issue, I must say.
Do you make an effort to discuss with PhD students and postdocs before they start with you of what the expectations is in terms of the time that you can commit to them?
Yeah, well, it's one of the things I tell them, and I think we'll get to that next in choosing a supervisor, is you should not, particularly as a postdoc, but even as a student, you should find out as much as you can about the lab you're going to and the style of the PhD supervisor, and it works both ways. There are a lot of kids who want to be independent, who could go to a lab where the PI is way too interested in what they're doing on a daily basis and never gives them any room to breathe. There's all sorts of styles as PhD supervisors, and different kids will need different things, and this information is not usually secret. The people in the lab certainly know what it's like, and those are the people who the potential students should talk to about finding out what they are actually getting into. That's all part of it.
And Phil, finally, have you had any experiences with PhD students who have unrealistic expectations of your role as a supervisor?
I would say it's the opposite. I think sometimes I've tended to give them a little bit more than they expect on the whole. I've gradually reduced my commitment to individual students over the years. When I started out, I tended to mollycoddle them rather a lot at the beginning. Now I think I've got the balance about right. On the whole, no, they don't, because they don't expect more than I can give them. I don't have any complaints. I give them a lot, but it's on demand. If the door's open, it's stressed that it's up to them to seek out the contact and the supervision if they need it. I'm not going to be on their case all the time saying we need to meet every week. If you want a meeting, you ask for it, and you come and see me. It is their role to manage the project and to drive it. They have to own it.
That's really wonderful to hear, actually, that all three of you have had really genuinely good experiences, and that you found that people don't have unrealistic expectations of what a supervisor is, because that does suggest that there is good communication going on there, and people do understand that a PhD is about being more independent than as an undergraduate.
Yeah, there's always some kind of admission process involving an interview or something, or maybe a student will have done a short project pre-PhD, and so they will know what the expectations are through having gone through that process, and a supervisor may have a good chance of knowing already the kind of student that they're taking on. Will they need a lot of technical direction, or will they be more of a free agent, and you will get the hang of it very quickly whether to allow a student more leeway to take the project in their own direction, or whether they're just not that kind of student.
That obviously takes us fantastically through to the next one, is how should a PhD student or potential PhD student choose a supervisor? And we'll start with you on this one, Phil. Are there any particular things that people should look out for, ask for, or determine before choosing a PhD supervisor?
One of the prompt questions is it better to choose based on the project or on the supervisor? And I think whilst there's a lot of open questions, I think there's a very clear cut that I would advise students to focus on the supervisor in the lab. Because first of all, a good supervisor isn't going to give you a bad project. The project by definition is going to be new, so you haven't got anything to go on, but you have got a track record of the supervisor in the lab to go on. Listen to what people who are already in that research group or who have been supervised by the supervisor say.
So if someone was choosing between, say, two different labs to go to, you would advise them very much go with how they feel, connection towards a supervisor and what the supervisor appears to be like, rather than which appears to be the more interesting project.
I think so. Usually the reason a PhD project fails is either because the student isn't good enough, or because the supervisor relationship with the student just doesn't work out, and it's not the project. If the student doesn't like the project, with the right supervisor they can guide it in a new direction and make it more to their liking. It takes a good student to be able to do that. This is the highest degree in the land that you expect them to be good. Always it's about, I think the supervisor, the flexibility and the mentoring and the guidance to let them choose their own direction within reason. It's all about the supervisor in that respect, not the project.
And do you think the traits such as things you're mentioning, that the time that they can give, the enthusiasm they have, what other people say about working with them, do you think that's more important than, say, statistics like how many papers they've published or their H-index or how much funding the lab has?
The statistics can lie, but I think seeing a good rate of publication from a supervisor is very important, and seeing what role the students have played in that publication record and the grant record. Also, it's really important to pick a lab that is well funded. There's nothing worse or more demotivating for a student than to be in a lab where they want to do an experiment but they just can't afford it, or they can't buy a piece of equipment. Basic stuff. Asking questions about the funding is very important.
Do you have anything to add to that, John? Anything that you feel are good things to look out for when picking a supervisor?
I think Phil did a fantastic job. You're much better off choosing it based on what the supervisor is than what the topic is. And for most people, they can sort of get interested in anything. And the main thing is the lab is doing good science. The only thing I would add is that all things being equal, it's probably better to go to a smaller lab than a really big lab. Really big lab, you may never see the supervisor. And then your training is up to whatever postdocs happen to be around who care. A small lab, you're going to see the supervisor. It's a very young person. They're going to grow up making mistakes on you, but in the end, it's probably a better experience. The very best you can do is to be the first student or two or three of a rising star. This happened to me completely by chance, both for my PhD and my postdoc, and basically lucky on my part, but boy, that really works well.
So do you have any tips for picking a rising star, or is it just luck?
A little bit more than luck. I mean, you get a sense, talk to other people, they think the person's really bright, has a promising future, and usually the science isn't the issue with a rising star. The issue is you're not chosen to run a lab based on your psychological insight or your ability to manage people or money. You're chosen because you're a good postdoc. And so that's the iffy thing, is the person just may be a disaster working with other people in a supervisory role. But most people aren't, and they learn it, basically. So that isn't that risky. You choose someone who is a fantastic postdoc, who's bursting with ideas when you go and talk to them. You're probably going to have a great experience. And I agree with Phil, though. You got to have money. If you can't do the experiment, not only is it frustrating, you won't learn as much either. It's just not good. So ideally, you go to someone young who's got enough money to do what they want to do, that they can start to fulfill their vision.
Do you have anything you'd like to add to that, Dana?
Yes, just one point about trying to pick a good lab. It's also maybe worth checking out where previous students and postdocs are working. Did they all head to academia, or some with government? That can help you get a sense of where you might head following your time with that supervisor.
Would you say that it is a warning sign if a lot of the PhD students haven't stayed in academia afterwards?
As someone who does very applied research, I don't know if I would call that a warning sign, but it certainly is an indicator that if you, for example, wanted to target an academic job, perhaps this may or may not be the right lab for you if people were headed to government, say.
But conversely, if you were interested to do a PhD for a PhD's sake but not necessarily stay in academia, that might be a good supervisor to go for, because there might be other doors that are open to you.
Absolutely.
And we'll start with you, Dana, for the next question, which is, what are the key roles and responsibilities that a PhD student has from the get-go? So we did start to touch on this in the beginning in terms of that they've got to be motivated, but what other things do you think that you really look for in a new PhD student?
I'm thinking of some of the typical work ethic, creativity, motivation cannot be taught. You have to come in with that. That point's been made. I think for me, that initial curiosity is extremely important. Having a student express to me their interests, but then also being receptive to me shaping those interests, pushing them in a direction that can make for an effective question, that's about communication as well. I need to be able to have these conversations with new students to sort of put them on the right track. In most of the projects conducted in my lab, there is a fair amount of flexibility in how the students can actually generate their specific questions. And learning to ask that question is something I really try to cultivate with my students.
Is that something that you look for maybe during an interview, if someone's got that interest?
Absolutely, but sometimes it doesn't really express itself until the student has been around the lab for a bit, has done some reading, has done some checking into the broad research area, and then together we sort of drill down and come up with some good questions.
Okay, so you mentioned the literature there. How much is it the student's role to make sure they keep up with the literature? Should the supervisor be letting them know what the latest papers are, or should they really be taking the reins with that? And that includes initial PhD students who first come into the lab.
And I feel this is a shared responsibility, and I always set my students off with some core literature. As I learn of new papers relevant to them, I send it their way, and I expect sort of the same coming back from them at times. When a student finds a really exceptional paper, we read it as a lab. You know, we talk about its relevance across the whole group. It's sort of a shared lab responsibility.
And what about their time management? Because going from doing an undergraduate project where, you know, your schedule's timetabled, you've got this lecture, then this lecture, then this lab, time management can be quite difficult. Do you play an active role in helping the student manage their time to begin with?
I do at first, because I think working at the level of a PhD is a big transition for a lot of students. And especially when elements of a project might have a deadline associated with a grant, I am absolutely trying to help them see exactly how long certain steps will take, analyses will need to be run under a certain time frame, so that we don't miss that deadline, so that they can be successful and then I am successful as well. And again, this level of input changes during the time a student is with me, and they ideally become more independent towards the end.
Phil, have anything you'd like to add to that at all?
Totally agree. I think reading the literature, when I started out, I used to want to build their confidence by getting them to do something useful in the lab right at the beginning, but research is now so much faster than it was when I started out, and that this a long time ago. I took on my first PhD student in 1987, so it was a hell of a long time ago, and the pace wasn't the same as it is now. So you could start a project in the lab and rely on the literature knowledge that you had accumulated up to that point, but things are now moving so fast that it's very dangerous to start a PhD student on a particular project or a particular experiment without them updating themselves up to the minute of the last few months of literature between when the project was designed and the day they start in the lab. So they now, in my group, spend the first couple of months at least purely on literature work to absolutely crystal clear picture before experiment one.
So we've actually had a question for the audience about terms of being up to date with the literature, and I think this is something that's quite interesting. Do you think, like, a lot of students may not know how to keep up with the literature when they start the lab? Do you try and actively show them how they can keep on top of the literature?
We tend to teach that at undergraduate or master's level. We have systems in place to do that, and we find that most institutions who send students to us are as up to date and as smart at using search engines and so on as we are, often better because, you know, they've been introduced to the latest things, and we as academics are just catching up. I do rely very heavily on students to keep me updated, and I keep them updated to some extent just to set an example. But really, most of the literature updating is done by them. I learn more from them in that respect. Again, it's part of the self-motivation thing. It's part of their responsibility. It's their project, and it's their job to find the literature and share it with not just me but with their colleagues.
Do you think that they should set aside time each week to make sure that they keep up with the literature, or is that something they should be doing out with lab time?
Well, I don't manage their time to that extent. I tell them right at the beginning, this is your PhD, and you ain't going to get a PhD if you work 9 to 5 Monday to Friday. The rest of them, they can manage it how they want. What I insist that they're around the lab or at their desk at reasonable times, because they have to communicate with other students and other scientists, and if they're working at night, that's very inefficient. And so working normal hours is an important discipline, I think. If a student comes along and wants to work at night and not during the day, that's not going to work, because it's a team effort and they have to know that. No,
very true. But you would be more than happy if your student was about during the day, but spending maybe a small portion of that reading the literature.
Oh yeah, I don't personally want to manage their time to the extent that they, I don't bully them into spending certain amounts of time in the lab. In fact, in my lab is so multidisciplinary, they wouldn't be able to effectively work in the lab all the time, because the experiments are complex and they have to spend a lot of time away from the lab analyzing the results. If they don't do that properly, they will go and spend more inefficient time in the lab later on. In my place, there isn't the lab facilities for them all to be in the lab at the same time. It's very multidisciplinary. They'll use a different technique in a different lab every day of the week, potentially. So, in fact, in my lab, nobody has their own bench. They all they share, and it's a hot benching system.
It puts it very much in the students' domain that they really should be managing their time. They should be making sure that they read the literature, and they shouldn't be prompted.
If they come and ask me, then I will give them some guidance, but they have to take the initiative.
Okay. Do you have anything you'd like to add to that at all, John?
Agree with everything said, and the only thing I'll address is what's on the slide that hasn't been done. So everything on the slide, students are responsible for, basically. Again, they've got to own their project and their life, particularly once they've been there for a year or two. Let me just address the work-life balance. I would put the balance heavily on work. Science is not easy. It doesn't pay terribly well. The reward is the work itself. People should feel like they're lucky to be able to come to a lab and do this sort of thing. They should appreciate that until maybe 50 years ago, no other human being who ever lived could do this as a job. And for them, it should be a labor of love. And labor of love is a lot of labor. And you should love it, but it also takes effort. And for most people, we're talking at least 50 or 60 hours a week, not necessarily in the lab, but certainly doing lab-related activities like reading papers. And when we're talking keeping up with the literature, it isn't just the new literature you need to know. Depending on how big the field is, we're talking about the old literature as well. Knowing the old literature is very important for actually knowing what we do know about what the topic is. And also there are many, many gems in the old literature, old observations, which people never could make sense of, that could turn into fantastic discoveries with today's techniques. So keeping up with the literature is also keeping back with the literature. And in general, a student should be focused on a life as a scientist. This should never be confused with a normal job. It's not a normal job. If you're going to be a scientist and be a PI particularly, you're competing with thousands of people around the world, most of whom are willing to make a major, major commitment of their time and selves. And you will not be competitive with them if you don't do it. Just to reiterate, it shouldn't feel like work. It should feel like, wow, I can't believe how lucky I am that someone will let me do this.
Is there such a thing as too much, though? I mean, is there at any point that you would feel that you would want to say to a student...
Past 80 hours a week, we start wondering about mental illness.
Okay.
But up until that point... it's all pretty good. But yeah, I mean, there is still time to have a friend or two or a boyfriend or a girlfriend. There's certainly time to have exercise. I think every day exercise should be part of that. It's one of the things that will help people stay sane and healthy. But by and large, I mean, it is a time to focus on something. And being a really good scientist, it's like being a really good violinist. It takes talent and work. Either one alone is not enough. It takes both.
Yeah. I read somewhere that there's a 10,000 hour rule, that if you want to be an expert or a master at anything, that you need to spend 10,000 hours doing it. No matter how good you are, you won't get there if you don't put the
It's about
the
right.
work in.
You know, you look at how long it takes to get a PhD, and I've done the calculation. That's about right. But the commitment is really, really important, that, you know, heart and soul, you are devoted. And the beauty of that as well is that your subconscious will be working over the experiments, the failures, the successes, and ideas will just pop up out of nowhere because your subconscious is working on it when you're obsessed with it. So I think obsession is a key part of it. It may not be particularly healthy mentally, but it's very important to be successful in science. You've got to have this level of obsession with what you're doing.
Somebody once told me, which really changed my view actually on PhDs. If you've managed to get a PhD, if you've been enrolled into a program, you're already intelligent enough to pass it. Whether or not you get it is then all down to the work that you put in. Very much 99% perspiration. Would you agree with that?
Yes and no. I mean, there's still very, very large differences in talents and abilities for doing bench science and thinking about creative answers. So you certainly have an above average IQ, and here's one of the problems with picking PhD students is you can't just base it on who has the best test scores or comes across the best in an interview. The very brightest kids sometimes, the most oral kids, will be a disaster in the lab because they can't pay attention to detail. They can't really synthesize information. They're perfectly good at spitting it back at you, something you've taught them, or they can memorize, but they don't have the creative spark. And one of the problems with picking kids is that a lot of times your best students will be the ones with the least promising academic records, who just have a knack for it. They're good at knowing what's important, and that's something that's extremely important. They're really good people. They have somehow an innate ability to know what the most important aspect of a set of information is, or doing an experiment, or picking up on what seems to be a minor result but is actually a major result. This sort of thing, you can't even know yourself whether you have it until you've tried it.
Trial by fire.
It really is, and the one thing I've always appreciated about the English system as opposed to the American one, the American system, we sort of re-educate you when you get here. We have a year or two of courses, and you have to get through that before you can actually start in the lab. And when I was a postdoc in England in the early 80s, the system was pure in the sense you had 3 years to do your PhD, you got thrown into the swimming pool, and you either sunk or you swam. And that was actually pretty good at picking out the talented swimmers. I thought that had a lot going for it because at the end of the day, if you're going to run your own lab, it's based on those skills it takes to work independently.
And in terms of working independently, that leads us on to my next topic, which is when a new student starts, how well planned out should their projects be, and how much input should they have in this initial stage? Should they be rolling up to the lab, expecting their supervisor has a nice 3-year plan laid out, or should it be a lot more fluid, and should they be discussing it with the supervisor before they've started?
Yeah, well, absolutely discuss with the supervisor, but unless it's applied research, translational research, which I would not encourage anybody to do a PhD on because you'll learn how to be a technician and not a scientist. I mean, the way the best discoveries are, you have a vague idea of what you'd want to do, and you start studying it, and you hope all your hypotheses are wrong anyway. So you can't have a plan. The only plan is you're going to be smart, and you're going to start doing experiments, you're going to have hypotheses, and then as they fail one by one, you're going to come up with better hypotheses, and in an ideal project, from day to day, you don't necessarily know what you're doing. It's based on the data that you get, and you're going to plan the next experiment. So you want to go into an area that looks promising, where it looks like you might learn something, but at the same time, you really hope that it will be completely different from what you anticipated. It's sort of like Columbus. You sort of know that India is to the west, and you're going to get there maybe. Okay? It really is just it's a process of discovery, and if you find something more interesting like America, well, that's sort of the plan.
How about you, Phil? Do you feel that what John said there is very true, and you can't have a...
I would say, though, that I think a bit of planning is always a good thing. There should be something of a brief, and it could be fairly detailed depending on the kind of the project, but you have to be prepared to scrap it at the drop of a hat and start again, because I think it's important to get to spend time utterly focusing on getting completely au fait with the literature at the very beginning, and then your whole plan might change before you even start in the lab. And that's why you need to do that literature work, because it's probably appropriate that it does change because the planning has been imperfect or inadequate, or it's just been too long since the plan that the project actually starts. I think planning is I've learned a bit more about, I'm a terrible manager, and I've always completely dismissed planning and coming up with a detailed brief and all of the stuff that goes with it, and Gantt charts and all that. But, as I get older, I begin to see the value of it, but you have to be ready to just abandon it and change direction. And if you've got a student that comes up with something, then within reason, it's really gratifying to let them go with it and run with it, something that is their baby. Yeah, have a plan, but be very, very flexible.
So you're not going to know what you're doing in 3 years' time when you start your PhD?
Definitely not. You're going to have a really miserable time as a PhD student if you know that much.
Dana, you actually work in a slightly more applied. So does that ring true for you as well, what Phil and John have said?
I do agree with the points that were made, and even as I do work in a bit of an applied area, it's essential to be adaptable to keep the science robust. The point was made earlier how fast science changes. And in my world, I'm working on natural systems managed by agencies, and problems come up, unfortunately, more quickly than we would like, and we have to be positioned to help people think about a new invasive organism or some new landscape threat to river systems, and I'm being a little specific here, but just to give you a sense of how important that adaptability can be to be able to meet the manager's needs.
Moving on to the next question, and this is something that you started to talk about in the answers to previous questions, which is the progress that you expect to see from a student throughout their course. How much progress? What are the key things that you think that a PhD student should be showing as they move through their course?
By the end of a student's PhD career, I expect them to have the ability to identify and plan out how they will answer relevant ecological questions. They have to learn through their time as a student how to do this, or else I don't feel I've done my job. They should be comfortable talking with other researchers about their work, about new directions. They should have some sense of how to form collaborations and network. They should have given multiple presentations by the time they reach the end of their PhD. And ideally, they have a couple publications under their belt. That's an expectation that I think all of us would probably share.
John, how do you feel about that? Are there any key things that you look for or expect a student to do? Say by the end of their first year they should be able to do this, end of the second year maybe be able to do that?
Every student is so different. Some of them after 6 months will be acting like a fifth-year graduate student, a fourth-year graduate student. So I don't think you can make a timetable like that. And I think by the end of your PhD, I can recount a story that Arnie Levine, whose lab I worked with as an undergraduate at Princeton, told me. He said by the end of your PhD, you ought to think your advisor, you should still think your advisor is a nice guy, but a little bit stupid. So that I completely agree with. I mean, by the end of it, you ought to really be thinking independently. You know, have a little bit of an ego and think that, you know, you could deal for yourself from now on and pick your own problems and know how to work with them. You know, that being said, being a postdoc. So ideally, by the end of a PhD, a student is a mini PI. We're going to get to the fact that most people won't be PIs, and so I don't want to, you know, make it sound like I don't realize that. I do, but you know, certainly something that you should learn during your PhD, and Dana touched on this, is you should learn how to be able to present yourself intelligently in front of a group of people, either in a meeting or in a formal presentation. We haven't talked about it yet, but you should know how to write much better by this point, how to write coherently and succinctly and logically, how to think the same way. And so all this is all part of the maturation process. And the beauty of the PhD training is it isn't just training you to be a scientist, it should be training you for any sort of interesting, high-functioning job in today's societies. And so you're expecting the people to be more mature intellectually, and you're also expecting them to grow up emotionally. During the course of the PhD, many students will now be married or getting serious about it, and all of this is just part of the normal maturation process, and you certainly hope to see that.
Do you have anything you'd like to add to that, Phil?
Yeah, I was getting a bit worried that nobody mentioned writing, but John just did, and writing is something that doesn't necessarily come that naturally. There's two aspects. One is to write coherently, as John said, and the other is to organize information in a coherent way to tell a story, because you're going to have to do that until you start writing your thesis. Very few PhD students have any experience of that. They might have written the odd essay, but if they're in a science subject, there will be even very small amounts, even that level of writing. So it sometimes comes as a shock in the last sort of fifth of your PhD that you find you're no good at writing. You can be the smartest guy on the planet, but if you can't write, nobody will think you're smart. So it is a terribly important skill, not just for the science, but for your whole life, to be able to express yourself not just verbally in presentations, but on paper by writing coherently. And your first real opportunity to learn to do that is probably as you start writing up your PhD. The supervisor, as we'll come to, has a big part to play in showing you where you're going wrong in that, at least, if not actually teaching you how to write, in at least showing you where you're going wrong.
We'll just move on to the next question. It's somewhat related to that, in the fact that you mentioned in terms of writing up your thesis, how much feedback, not only in writing up the thesis, but throughout the whole course of the PhD, should a student expect? And on a personal note, this is something that I personally really struggled with. I went from undergraduate, where you get graded on everything, you know how well you're doing because you've got a mark. But as a PhD student, you don't get those sorts of feedback. So how much should a supervisor be telling the student that they're doing well, or how much should they just be expected to know they're doing well?
I do think that on that particular aspect, the supervisor has an important role. I'm very hands-off when it comes to what the students do day to day, let them have a lot of freedom within their project and take ownership of the project, but I think an important role is to give them feedback on how confident they should be. They need to gauge whether they, in the first year of their PhD, whether they're going to continue. They need to know what their weaknesses are, and I think your job is to point out their weaknesses and their strengths fairly constantly. A lot of the students that I'm a head of department, so I see a lot of the other students who are being supervised by other people, and one of the main complaints that comes to me sort of informally is that they don't know what their supervisor thinks of them and how they're getting on. I think it's something that supervisors can be unaware of unless somebody tells them. Their students lack confidence because they're just not being told how they're performing.
Dana, how about you? How do you feel about feedback, in terms of what feedback do you provide to your students, and how important do you think it is for a supervisor to do that?
I think it's extremely important, and I also agree that students need to hear where they excel and where they could improve. In any professional setting, in academia, I recently went through the tenure process, and through that had to articulate what my strengths were and where I wanted to enhance my skills. This was a couple of years ago. And I had never been that introspective as a graduate student, and I think that experience has helped me advise my own students and see what they're great at, where they need to work, and be really honest about that. It matters not only for your own success, it helps you identify good collaborators It helps you know where you're going to perform your best at. I think it's essential.
John, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I agree completely, and it's something you get better at as a PI is giving feedback. At NIH now, we're mandated to meet at least once a year with everybody to give them feedback, and I think that's extremely important. Sciences are usually not very good at giving feedback, and this is something that may have to be mandated at the department level, because this is really, really important, both the positive and the negative. At the same time, particularly on negative comments, you don't want to pull the trigger too soon. You need to give people time to fail before they succeed, and you just want to give people the chance to succeed before you have to be very careful with negative criticism, and it should never be given with adjectives. It should always be given in the most positive way as well. Positive criticism is very good, easy. Equally important, one of the biggest problems people have is a lack of self-confidence when they should have it. At the same time, sometimes it's really important to tell people things that you think they need to improve at, and there is a way to tell people, though, that is less painful for them and for you. That's something that you would learn, but it probably could be taught. You know, it wouldn't be the worst thing. I'm not really in favor of all these programs we have and these mandatory training things, but it wouldn't be the worst thing when you start out as a PI that you have a week or so of people who know how to work with people giving you advice on how to deal with people. Not a terrible thing.
Would you have any advice to students who feel that they're not getting enough feedback, that they just don't know where they stand?
Yeah, just go into your PI's office and ask her, how am I doing? What do you think? The onus shouldn't be on them, but they also shouldn't feel shy about it. I mean, you owe them that as their supervisor. That's part of your job, is to evaluate them and help them and make positive criticisms. Negative criticisms are useless. Constructive criticism, excuse me.
If a student is having problems in the lab with their supervisor or in the lab day to day, how is this best dealt with? If they feel that their supervisor isn't giving them enough feedback, even isn't giving them enough support or guidance, what can a student do to try and address this? And then we'll start with Phil on this one.
Yeah, this is tricky, and I think there's a role for the institution here. The institution needs to have things in place in order to accommodate this situation. So, for example, at King's, every student has 2 named supervisors. One is always the primary supervisor, but if there's always a second person to go to if they feel that things are not being addressed, or if there's a problem or there's some kind of failure in the relationship.
And would you say that the student should go to that second supervisor straight away, or should they try and address those problems with their supervisor?
I think, they will take advice from their peers. They can explore in a very gentle way with their second supervisor. They don't need to do it in a formal way. They can just sort of, have conversations that don't really mean anything and get a feel for it. And of course they need to also adapt to working with their supervisor. That's part of owning the project, and it's a problem that if there is a problem, it may be something they have to live with, or they can just slowly adapt and work on, and maybe if they're confident enough they can pick it up with the supervisor themselves. But there will be informal ways, which is the starting point. Address it with your peers. Ask another PhD student how they get on with their supervisor. Talk to the postdocs. There's a role for the institution in having structures in place to deal with this. A student should know what those avenues are. There'll usually be a handbook which tells them what the supervisory structure is. Some institutions have a supervisory committee for them to go to. We have a second supervisor, sometimes a third, and there will be an overseeing. Each department will typically have an overseeing postgraduate student coordinator who keeps an eye on the supervisory standards of the whole department, and that is another person to go to. So explore the informal routes first, but if it needs to go to a sort of a formal route, should be a system in place to deal with it.
On a related question, and I'll throw this one to Dana, in terms of the student-supervisor relationship, how fluid and flexible should students be, and supervisors as well, when creating that relationship? Should it be exactly how the supervisor wants it to be, or should there be a bit of give and take in that situation?
It's like any kind of relationship. There has to be some give and take. Your supervisor is an exceptionally busy individual. You are becoming a very busy person. You have to be adaptable in terms of time. You've got 2 different personalities coming together. You've got to be adaptable in terms of the style of your interaction. It's the only way to ensure that a relationship will be successful, is to have some patience with the other person.
Okay.
And I did want to follow up with a thought on challenges that arise between students and their supervisors. I think it's absolutely critical that the universities have mechanisms in place to help the students, but I would also suggest that if at all comfortable for the student, they should try talking to the supervisor first when appropriate, before it went to that higher level. Sometimes things can be resolved that are misunderstandings and can lead to really efficient outcomes.
Do you have anything you'd like to add to any of that, John?
No, I agree completely. You owe it to the PI to air it out with them first, and that's also the best course. But if that doesn't work, then there should be mechanisms in place. In the U.S., we have thesis committees with 4 or 5 faculty members usually, and that's their role, is not to blindly defend the PI, but to advocate for the student and work behind the scenes. And I think Phil really said it very, very well, in that you want to keep it as informal as possible for as long as possible. Once you get a university mechanism involved in something, a formal complaint going, it's going to be disastrous outcome likely for both participants, and typically the junior person suffers the most. If at all possible, you want to work things out as low-key as possible. Many problems also are best solved as fast as possible. Letting things fester is not good.
My final point is that I think this is something that PhD students, and I was completely guilty of this as well when I was doing my PhD, they forget the fact that their supervisor has other roles than to just supervise them. And I think it'd be really interesting to gain insight from you guys about what the other roles and responsibilities you have, what else eats up into your time during the day that takes away from being a supervisor and things that you have to do. We'll start with Phil on that one.
I've said my door is open when I'm here, but the fact is there is so much else to do, and you have to protect yourself as a supervisor from being open all hours. I prefer myself not to have office hours, but to have the door open, but then I protect myself by working at home for a day a week, or working where nobody can find me. The teaching commitment, teaching the undergraduates, they'll all know that you have to teach because they were undergraduates only a year or two ago themselves. I'm a head of department, so that brings a lot of administrative stuff, and you're not only a supervisor to your students, but you're a supervisor to other academics who are earlier in their career. There's exam setting. There's supervising PhD students is one of the most rewarding parts, actually. I look up on my bookshelf and see that row of PhD theses, and it's the most gratifying part of the job. But it's only a small part of the job. It's easy for me to say it's only a small part of the job, and so the students listening may feel quite small as a result of that, but I also stress that looking at that row of theses on my shelf is the most gratifying part of the job. Knowing that the students have gone out and got jobs as academics or in whatever they're doing. Some of them do medical training, some of them go into industry. Having played that part is great, but yeah, you just got to spend enough time looking through your supervisor's door to know that they are not only doing other jobs, but they're also supervising other PhD students.
Dana, do you have anything to add to that?
Just that I also feel like advising students is the best part of this job. The other day-to-day business includes writing grants, serving on committees, teaching, of course. I play a bit of an accounting role, managing the various grants that I have. I'm working with other students, other partners, but it's the one-on-one relationship that I have with my PhD students that hands down been the best part of this job so far.
And finally, John.
Actually, at NIH, I am incredibly protected, so I really don't have a lot to do all day other than think and talk to the people, so it's a bit different. This is probably the best job in the world in many ways. But I love the last slide, Thor with the hammer, and just the other aspect of that is that what are we? We supervisors, we're the students plus 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And are they perfect people? They are not. Are we perfect people? We are not. Just like with your parents. I mean, the students should realize we're not perfect. We make mistakes. Sometimes we lose our temper. Sometimes we say things we shouldn't. Sometimes we don't give perfect advice. And they should cut us some slack like we cut them some slack. Nobody's perfect in this game. We're all human beings, subject to whatever foibles humanity is, and a little bit of that goes a long way in greasing the skids of the social interaction in a lab. Just giving people space, that no one's going to be perfect all the time, and we may have said something we didn't really mean it, and all that. So don't expect your supervisor to be perfect, and we won't expect you to be perfect, and that's a good deal.
I think that is a wonderful way to end this webinar. There was lots more questions that we could have asked, but I think that was a really fantastic discussion. So thanks, Phil, Dana and John for that. I really, really enjoyed it, and I hope that the people listening did. And like I said, this is going to be available online, free for people to watch. It'll be up in the next 24 hours, so just head over to the webinar section of Bite Size Bio if you want to catch that again. We've also not quite finished our webinar lineup, so there's a few more, so check out the ones that are coming up in the next week or two, and you can also view there all the ones that we've shown previously. So yeah, once again, thank you panelists. That was really wonderful discussion, and we really appreciate you giving us your time today on that. And it just leaves me to say, until next time, good luck in your research, and goodbye from all of us at Bite Size Bio.